Thank you very much, everybody. I am very pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you. I think you will all be aware that universities and colleges are facing a lot of challenges at the moment. We're seeing a lot of changes in the outside world that are having major implications for how we teach and what we teach in universities. And universities and colleges will need to respond to those changes. And in particular, in order to help them address those changes, they're going to have to really have a good plan about how they're going to use technology in their teaching, especially. Technology will also impact other areas of the university, such as recruitment, registrations, etc. But I want to focus primarily in this session on what institutions need to do to effectively make use of technology to transform their universities to address the challenges they'll be facing. Let me give you an overview of what I want to talk about. I'm going to suggest that if our institutions don't change, they will die. They will be replaced by other kinds of organizations, primarily the big internet multinational companies who will move in to the space currently occupied, not by all universities, but by the majority. And I'll go through the reasons why I think the universities and colleges over the next 15 to 20 years will face an existential threat to their futures. I'll talk about some of the strategies for bringing about change in our institutions, some of the organizational issues that need to be addressed. I'll talk about some financial strategies that will be needed in order to enable these changes. I'll talk quite a bit about governance and how decisions should be made about technology in universities and colleges. And I'll end with talking about barriers to change. And then I hope there will be 15 to 20 minutes for your questions and discussion of some of the issues I'm raising. So first of all, change or die. That's a pretty challenging statement to make. And the reason I'm saying that is that automation in particular and artificial intelligence will have a major impact on the workforce primarily, but it's also having a major impact on our social lives and in terms of privacy and so on. And what this means in the future, there will be new jobs, and those jobs will require less and less the physical work of people and more their brains. And this is because artificial intelligence and automation will take over the routine work. Anything that can be, where the process can be written down, artificial intelligence can be built to carry out those processes. But the studies suggest that artificial intelligence will cause lots of jobs to go, but it will result in more and different jobs, and particularly jobs needing high-level intellectual skills. Now, that's good news for the universities because that's what they deal with. Skills such as critical thinking, problem solving, communication, and so on, but other skills as well, such as flexibility, independent learning, and so on. So it's not just the intellectual skills or academic intellectual skills, but other kinds of skills as well. And if you look at the slide here, this is a typical new company. This is 3 people. They design a specialist piece of equipment for the Volkswagen car in Germany. They are 3 engineers, basically, but they do everything. They do marketing, they do fundraising, investment, they do the design and so on. And so they need a wide range of skills besides engineering skills. They need to have good interpersonal communication skills. They have to have good language skills because they're often working in different languages and so on. And if we look at the way we teach at the moment, our teaching isn't actually what I would call objectively defined in creating those critical thinking and problem solving skills. We assume that students will somehow pick this up from the way that we teach, but a lot of research into this now suggests that we need to be more explicit and more clear in defining what skills we want students to develop and how we measure and assess those skills and how we evaluate the way we enable students to develop those skills. And that's the big challenge, because more and more organizations, particularly commercial companies outside of higher education, are listening to what employers are saying and are increasingly developing programs that develop these skills specifically. And I want to particularly draw a distinction between skills and content. Universities are very good at content. What the professor does usually, first of all, they decide what content students need. Then they pull that content together. They organize it in the form of a lecture, and then they deliver that lecture to students. And the hope is that students will pick up all kinds of things like critical thinking and so on as a result of that lecture. And I'm suggesting that content actually will become less and less important in higher education, not because students don't need content, but they don't need it delivered to them by the professor. In fact, what we want students to do is what the professor is doing. Know where to find information, how to evaluate the validity and the usefulness of that information, how to apply it to specific contexts, such as problem solving in a particular subject domain, and how to evaluate what they've done. And so increasingly, because the content is now out there, it's everywhere, it's on the internet, a lot of even the best academic content in the form of research papers is now available in open access journals. So students can get that information for themselves. What they can't get is the expert in developing the skills that they need in using that content, thinking critically about it, creative thinking, and so on. And the second thing that students need increasingly, because they need to use the internet and digital access, they need digital literacy within their discipline. And this, I'm not talking generally about coding here, I'm talking about something much broader than that. And that is knowing how to use digital technology within their subject discipline for achieving the goals that they're trying to achieve. And that means integrating the technology within the teaching so that students are using the technology as part of their teaching and learning. And particularly, delivering skills requires different teaching methods from lecturing, such as discussion groups, problem-based learning, experiential learning, and so on. These are different teaching methods from those that many professors and lecturers use at the moment. Many professors, or some professors are using one or more of these, but we're not really preparing our professors to teach in these ways. So the challenge for the universities is that if in the future people are to earn digitally, because they're going to be working with technology in the future, they need to learn digitally. They have to have that digital learning embedded in their teaching. And that means integrating technology into teaching and learning. And it means new course design and new teaching methods. And it means new methods of delivery. And in particular, we're seeing the development of blended and fully online courses, which by definition integrate the technology within the teaching. And if you look at this chart, you'll see what's happening basically with the use of technology in higher education. What we're seeing particularly is the removal of this very sharp distinction between face-to-face teaching and distance education. What's happening is the technology is becoming integrated within the classroom environment. So we're seeing the simplest form is classroom aids like this PowerPoint, and then we're seeing flipped classes where students see a video maybe of a lecture or go online and do some research, and then they come into the class to discuss or to show the work they've done. But more specifically, we're beginning to see what I call hybrid learning, where you deliberately reduce but don't eliminate the amount of face-to-face teaching, and you supplement it with deliberately designed online activities for the students. And I call that hybrid because it's not just taking a lecture and putting it on video, but it's looking at what are the things that students can do best in the classroom and what can they do best online. And so what we're seeing then is not so much this sharp distinction, but a continuum and different students with different needs. So for instance, lifelong learners are much happier being fully distant, fully online, because they're working, they've got families, they're very busy, and they have to fit their learning around their work and life. Whereas you have students coming out of high school who want the campus, they want the social life of a university and college. And then you have a lot of students who are part-time, who like the flexibility of hybrid learning and so on. So you have different students with different needs and different opportunities now for delivering to those students. So the challenge here is not really the race against universities in other countries. It's not a question of China coming in and taking over the higher education systems in North America, or North America coming over and taking all the students out of Africa and so on. It's not a fight against each other, but against the multinational internet platforms that can come in. And you'll see here a diagram of how this could work. I'm not going to go and describe this in detail. The internet platforms won't actually offer the teaching, but there'll be a service to commercial education providers and to students and employers. They'll act as a kind of network between those. And the internet platform will collect what kinds of skills are needed. Mainly, for instance, if you look at LinkedIn now, you can go through using artificial intelligence, you can work out what employers are looking for in their employees over the next 5 years. What are the key skills they're looking for? The commercial education providers can then build courses around those skills, and students can look for commercial education providers who are providing those skills. So this is the kind of threat that universities and colleges will have in the future. Now, obviously, institutions like Harvard or Beijing University will not be so effective because of their high status. People will always want to send the kids to a high status university like that. But the impact for what I will call the middle level or the lower level universities, and particularly the state funded universities, is very, very dangerous here. Unless they respond to these changes in the world outside, they could easily have their lunch eaten by these new internet companies. So the challenge is not so much about what kind of technology should you use in teaching, or about what should the infrastructure be, although those are very important questions, but really, what are the new or different teaching methods that we should be using to develop these skills, and how can technology help in the development of these new teaching methods? And in particularly, how do we integrate technology within teaching and learning so that students come out of their courses and programs digitally literate with the skills that they need, not just in the workforce, but managing their own lives, managing, for instance, their own privacy settings, their own ability to communicate with friends and colleagues online without worrying about the security of their data, for instance. So what are some of those strategies for change? Well, obviously leadership is needed. Now, I have to say that I would say that in Canada, about 30% of our presidents, particularly, and maybe about 25% of our vice presidents, academic, understand the challenge. and are willing to provide that leadership. And I would say the boards and the board of governors, even more so, probably 50% of the board of governors are aware that universities are going to have to change. But the further down you go in the organization, the less the awareness of the threat and the challenge. And the leadership has to come not just at that top executive level, but really at the departmental level and from senior academics who understand the situation and have strategies for dealing with it. And in particular, from this level of leadership, we need vision, direction, resources, and monitoring. That's their role here. Not to do it, but to provide the vision and direction and the support to the faculty to do these things. And I'll give an example here of vision at an institution-wide level, for instance. Within 5 years, 75% of all classes will be hybrid and 25% will be fully online, supporting the development of skills. Secondly, we will support students throughout their life. We will expect that 50% of our enrollments will be lifelong learners within 10 years. They won't be students coming out of high school. There'll be people in the workforce already coming back for other courses. Thirdly, we will develop new short qualifications that integrate with standard degrees. They've developed specifically for lifelong learners. Now, what that would mean is that, say you had an engineer that left with a PhD or a master's, but they will continue to need to learn new skills and new technologies as they come along, and they won't want to go to university for 3 or 4 years. What they want at the most is probably a 3-month course that they can take online, and that once they've got that, they'll move on to something else, but they want to build those courses, those qualifications into perhaps a further degree, a further master's in, say, more advanced engineering technologies than they did when they developed. So that's what I mean by setting some strategies or setting a vision statement for the use of technology and teaching. And this requires flexible plans, not at an institutional level, although it needs institutional leadership, but primarily at the program and department level, because that's where the teaching is done. And this means plans that are reviewed annually, depending on how fast or slow the department can bring about these changes. And these would include things like targets. Now, I gave some examples of targets for blended and fully online learning and for lifelong learners. What kinds of initiatives or actions the department can take to move in those directions? What are the resources that the department or the institution has to provide to help instructors move in that direction? What kind of support staff will the instructors need? By support staff, I mean people like educational technologists who can help them with the design of courses and the choice of technology, with web designers, for instance, to help them put their materials online, maybe some programming help to use social media and to build apps. So you need those support staff as well. What kind of budget, what kind of money is needed to do this, and where's that money going to come from? And lastly, tracking progress. How well are we doing in terms of the targets we set ourselves, and what more must we do next year to move towards those targets? So I think every academic department now needs some kind of flexible plan about not so much its use of technology, but how it's going to, what kind of curriculum it's going to offer, what kind of teaching methods are going to be used, and what kind of technologies will be used to support that teaching. So that means curriculum planning focused on skills development. And I've got a little chart up here. This is from the Faculty of Computer Sciences at Dalhousie University. They were finding that in their Bachelor of Computer Sciences, about 30% of the students who entered the program never graduated. So they sat the faculty down and looked at what each faculty member was doing, what their what the content of their courses, what they were trying, what their learning outcomes were they were trying to get from each of their courses. And when they did this and each of the faculty members looked at what they were doing, they realized, for instance, that the theory courses, which are taught in the 4th year, were really needed in the 1st year, because unless students understood the theory behind computer science, they couldn't progress easily to the other stages. And what they came up with was a curriculum plan where a student could go in and see what they needed in terms for what the learning outcomes were were needed right through the bachelor's program, and which courses they had to do first, and what prerequisites they needed for other courses and so on. And that can be done in terms of the learning outcomes and the skills that you're trying to develop in computer scientists as you go through. And it needs, and also not just the learning outcomes. How do you progress skills from year 1 through to year 4? So let's assume we're teaching critical thinking skills. What are you going to do in year 2 that will further the critical skills development in year 1? How will the teaching support in the 2nd year, the 1st year, and what will happen in the 3rd year to further develop those critical thinking skills, so that those critical thinking skills progress as students work through a program? And lastly, what kind of new qualifications are needed, particularly for lifelong learners? Because there's going to be more lifelong learners in the future than there are students coming out of high schools. And so that's your future target audience. So what qualifications do they need beyond the basic qualifications of a bachelor's degree and maybe a postgraduate degree? The second area is, what are the incentives or rewards for faculty for innovative teaching? Can the promotion criteria, do they need to be revisited to look at making innovative teaching more rewarding? Now, at the university in Canada, the major university there, the associate vice president for teaching and learning said, well, we have tenure track positions for teaching. And I said, well, how many do you have? And she says, we have over 100 now. And I said, how many tenured faculty do you have? 5,000. I said, well, that indicates where the priorities are. The priorities are for research. That's how you get on in your university. 100 tenured positions for teaching is not going to be enough. Secondly, you need funds for new designs, and particularly to enable faculty to go through a learning process to learn how to teach differently. You need to reduce their teaching load for a year or 2 in order to get so they have time to relearn how to teach and how to manage their new teaching methods without being swamped with too much teaching. And that may mean reducing class size for a year or 2 for some instructors to enable them to learn and to change. And also, you need to provide more technical support for faculty so that they know how to use a learning management system. They know how to use a video conferencing and so on. They know, more importantly, when it's best to use a learning management system and when it's best to use a video conference. So those are some of the strategies. Now, what does that mean for the organization of an institution? Well, there are some things that still need to be done centrally. An organization will depend on the size of the institution. The bigger the institution, the more you have to decentralize. But basically, there are some common principles, whether the institution is big or small. There are some things that need to be done centrally, such as the telecoms infrastructure, the telephone system, the net, the internet connections, the connection with the outside world from the university through the internet and so on. And technology security needs to be central. Obviously, administrative software applications, these are often big databases and they require some kind of central organization, although increasingly a lot of this stuff is being done in the cloud, but those decisions really should be made centrally rather than locally in terms of administration, not teaching. I'll come back to that in a minute. And there are some teaching technologies like learning management systems or video conferencing or classroom technology like overhead projectors and screens, that probably should be organized centrally. The systems that are shared between different departments, really, there needs to be some central organization. But more and more, the technology is allowing us to decentralize decision-making. And the more you can decentralize it, in my view, in terms of teaching, the better. So the choice of, for instance, mobile applications, that should be left to an instructor. They know their subject matter better and can look at how mobile applications could be used in their teaching for mobile phones. Social media, blogs and wikis are probably best managed locally. Now, you might need a little bit of central organization to enable faculty to learn how to use a blog or develop a wiki, but the actual management of the blogs and wikis should be left to faculty and the students. And there are subject-related technologies. Virtual reality, for instance, is much more useful in some subject areas than others, and that really should be a decision made locally. And also in terms of simulations and games, that choice should be the faculty member's choice, maybe helped by somebody from from a learning support unit. And again, I'll talk about the importance of making those learning technology support units as local as possible rather than centralized. Now, I'm going to be very blunt here. Most faculty have no training in teaching. A PhD is a training in research, not in teaching. And yet we need new course designs, and they need help with that, and they need direct technology support. Increasingly, they will need just-in-time resources. Now, I'll give you one example of that. You want to do a video, not a lecture, but you want to create a video, maybe demonstrating an experiment or in the lab and so on, but that you want students to have access to. What University of British Columbia has done, it's created just-in-time a website where you can go about and learn about very quickly good video design, how to make a very good, cheap, simple video with your mobile phone, for instance. And it's based on research into how students best learn from video. And you can click for each of the pieces of guidance that the website gives. There's a link you can go to see the research that supports that decision about how to use the technology. Increasingly, students are going to open education resources. I'll give you one example. My grandson in England told me he goes to 1 in 3 lectures. And I said, that's a funny number. He says, yes, well, I've got 2 friends. And we take it in turns to go to our physics lecture because he's so bad. We just take down the topics and we send an email to each other, and then we look up these topics on the internet. Increasingly, students have access to open education resources. Why not the faculty as well? Bring those open education resources that are free to use, that are designed for teaching and learning, into your teaching and make them available to the students. And then there are tools to enable students to work, like e-portfolios, for instance. And e-portfolios, students can keep a record of the digital work they do, including videos of maybe practical work, for instance, that they've done. And they can build up that e-portfolio of work and curate it. So there's a whole range of things that faculty need training in. And technology permeates all aspects of a university these days. So it doesn't make sense to have silos where somebody over here is responsible for learning management systems and nobody can touch it and nobody can change it. You need to bring the faculty in and say, well, what do we want from this learning management system? Can we make suggestions, or can we choose a different learning management system because it fits our needs better? What are the means for having that discussion? Are they set up in a formal way so that it's easier for people to share ideas and so on? At the same time, you need clear mandates. It has to be clear who's responsible for doing what. That might be joint responsibilities, but you need to know what is joint and what isn't. That means you have to have a clear organizational structure for managing technology. And in particular, you need to push the technical support as close to the end users as possible. And increasingly students are becoming tech support. They often know more about the technology than the instructors do. And some institutions now have what they call tech counselors, who are students who volunteer to help faculty use the technology. So again, they're usually trained. They've trained first, the students, but they often are easier to train than the faculty, and it's easier for the faculty to call on a student to help them than have to do it themselves. And I'll give an example of an organizational structure here. The blue is the academic side, the vice president academic, who has a strategy team for digital learning. And there's usually an associate vice president for teaching and learning. And there's probably a centralized center for teaching and learning. But in this model, as much as possible of that center is downloaded to the individual academic department. So they'll each have teaching tech support. Now, why there's a central department here is that these tech support people will be employed by the center but allocated to the academic departments. That's because in the past, deans, often looking to find extra money for extra faculty, will fire or hire these people on contract, and then when they need more faculty, they'll fire these people and use the money for faculty. So it's a good model is to have these people employed centrally, but for the deans to negotiate with the Centre for Teaching and Learning the allocation of this staff, and that allows flexibility. So for instance, if business is deciding that it's going to go into blended and hybrid learning in a big way over the next 5 years and need lots of support, while arts had that support 5 years ago and is now going well, then you can move that tech support over to support the business people. And then on the left-hand side, you have the technology people and the CIO. And you'll notice the CIO reports both to the VP administration and the VP academic, because a lot of the technology area is in the academic side. And there are certain areas that the red part are responsible for. And the amount this is centralized and decentralized will depend on the size of the institution. But again, the more you can push the support down locally, the better. And lastly, for financial strategies, you need more money, or you need to find or reallocate money. And how do you do that? Well, one way is you can grow enrollments and resources through online learning, particularly depending on the financial model in your country. But if you're allowed to charge tuition fees, then you can grow your enrollments, particularly in the lifelong learning market, through online learning. You get more students, you get more money in. You can also have savings on campus overheads. If you have students doing 50% of their studying online and 50% in class, you reduce the demand on traditional classroom space. What that means basically is that you keep the same facilities, because you're not going to throw away your classrooms, but you can gradually increase the numbers without having to build extra classrooms. You can ensure new revenues and savings are returned to the teaching departments. And I'll give you an example. The first online program developed at the University of British Columbia back in 2003, the faculty had no incentive to do a fully online program. They had enough students coming in for their face-to-face courses. So the university went to the dean and said, look, what we'll do is we'll allow you to put, if you create an online program, these will be extra students above the face-to-face ones you're getting, and we will allow you to keep the tuition fees to hire new research faculty, so that, and these are new students coming in, and they won't replace your old students. And they'll allow you to grow the department. And overnight, that program doubled the number of graduate students in the department, and that program's been running successfully now for 20 years. So you need some creative budgeting here to move people into this direction. And the other thing is, I keep saying, is make students do the work. One of the things you have to do is to make students more responsible for their learning. Make them go and find the information, make them write the reports on what they found. That's what they're going to have to do when they leave the university. You might as well teach them to do it now, And that can take quite a bit of load off the faculty, particularly if the students are doing collaborative work, and then you mark the project and not individual students, or allow the students to divide up the marks amongst themselves as to the contribution each student has made to the work. So there are various ways to take some of the burden of teaching off the faculty to move them into these new directions. Know the cost of different course designs. The chart on the right, the different colors represent planning the program, the cost of developing online courses, the cost of delivering them, and the overheads the university wanted from the tuition revenues. Know what those are and negotiate them. The Masters of Educational Technology brought a general overhead cost of 40% of tuition fees down to 25% simply by going through the items for which the overheads were used, such as heating and lighting. These were online students. They did not need heating and lighting on the campus. Car parking was another big one. Students don't park their cars, they park them at home if they're doing an online course. So there are all kinds of ways to look at how money can be reallocated and redesigned. And lastly, governance. The board and senior executives have set the overall vision for where the institution wants to go with its use of technology. But the individual strategies should be at all levels, and that should empower even students to help with envisioning the kind of strategies that would enable the better use of technology in the institutions. So set up a student council to advise on what technologies don't work for them, for instance, or what technology they'd like to see being used in their subject areas. But clear decision-making mandates, the more local, the better. Collective decision-making through committees and collaboration, and above all, support a culture of change. Encourage people to do things differently and don't punish them if it doesn't work. By all means, evaluate and find out what went wrong, but reward the people who try new things, even if they don't always work. And the barriers to change, well, the culture of the sage on the stage, the professor in front of the class. Professors like that. It's great, it's an ego trip, but it's not what students need in the future. The faculty reward system, try to change that if you can, good luck with that. Lack of pre-service training of instructors. I see no reason why we shouldn't ask postgraduate students to do a 3-month course in teaching, an obligatory course in teaching as part of their PhD. And if they haven't done that, don't employ them in a tenured position, because they're going to have to teach anyway in a tenured position. And lastly, many academic administrators are not aware of requirements for successful technology applications. They often need training. They need to spend at least the first month talking to the Learning Technology Support Unit about how technology is being used and what the challenges are. So in conclusion, new focus on skills development for the 21st century requires curriculum redesign and technology integration in teaching and learning. But that in itself won't happen on its own. It needs vision and strategies and organizational changes and a clear plan for faculty development. And that has to come in some extent from the senior administration, but it has to be fully supported at the departmental level and particularly by the deans. And yes, change is hard. My wife is very good at saying I'm good at telling everybody else to change, but I'm not very good at doing it myself. But unfortunately, if we don't change, we won't survive. And I think that the threats to universities coming down through the use of technology by the big internet companies is very, very real. And we need to change rapidly, more rapidly than we are if we're to succeed. Thank you very much.